Today we look at Michael Shellenberger's excellent book, Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. Everyone wants to save the planet and governments are spending trillions. But are they doing it the right way? This book is an important work because it challenges many of the common beliefs on these issues. I'll cover the main ideas and highlight the most shocking and thought-provoking information from the book. First, don't be fooled by the title. Shellenberger is not an ultra-MAGA denier of the global warming narrative. He's been an environmental activist for decades and says Apocalypse Never defends mainstream science from those who deny it on the political right and left. It's about getting the facts and science right. There are no conspiracy theories in the book. Most chapters have over 100 citations documenting respected sources. Chapter 1 is Not the End of the World, starts with some of the typical climate disaster predictions in the press, then documents the good news that never gets reported. The IPCC did not say the world would end, nor that civilization would collapse if temperatures rose above 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's been a 92% decline in death by natural disaster since the 1920s. The IPCC's medium scenario for sea level rise is only 2.2 feet by year 2100, and even the high-end prediction of 2.7 feet, 83 centimeters, gives the world lots of time to adapt. For example, much of the Netherlands is already 7 meters below sea level and doing fine. Forest fires are not becoming worse because of climate change. Previous predictions of coral reef destruction were based on fabrications. The UN's Food and Agricultural Organization says crop yields will increase with various scenarios. Food production results are affected more by tractors, irrigation, and fertilizer than by climate change, even suggesting production in the sub-Saharan could increase 40% with the right technology, even in the face of climate change. And the IPCC projects a 4 degrees Celsius temperature increase would reduce world GDP by only 4.5%, which is negligible, as they project the world economy to be from 200% to 500% larger by then. So don't worry about future threats when there are humanitarian disasters now. Shellenberger recounts a trip to Congo, a country where only 1 in 5 have electricity. It was worse in the city of Goma. 2 million people rely on wood for energy. His travels also brought him to Virunga National Park, where nearby subsistence farmers eke out a living, often suffering when wandering animals like baboons and gorillas raid their vegetable gardens. These issues are covered more in Chapter 4. In Chapter 1, Shellenberger follows up on some news stories. He contacted 2 scientists quoted in the media who told him they'd been misquoted and misinterpreted, making the reported stories far scarier. And a top Extinction rebellion activist finally admitted that there was absolutely no science behind their prediction of billions dying due to a climate catastrophe caused by carbon. If it was their goal to save lives, making energy more expensive is counterproductive. Then there was the Associated Press article saying the UN claims rising sea levels could wipe entire nations off the face of the earth, and that governments only have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve it. It turns out that the article was published in 1989. None of these errors are ever retracted. The exaggeration continues, leading to rising levels of depression in people, particularly children. Chapter 2 involves the Amazon rainforest, described by hyperbolic activists as the Earth's lungs. Fires in the Amazon were big news in 2019, with celebrities like Leonardo DiCaprio, Madonna, and Ronaldo sounding the alarms. Media claim that the Amazon stores 25% of the world's carbon, with these fires reducing the planet's lung capacity. So Shellenberger called IPCC lead author Dan Nepstadt to ask about the claims. It's bullshit. There's no science behind that. The Amazon produces oxygen, and it uses the same amount. All life stores carbon. The Amazon's share is about 5% of the world, not 25%. In reality, almost everything the news media reported in summer 2019 about the Amazon was either wrong or deeply misleading. International outrage was directed at Brazilian President Bolsonaro. Greenpeace pushed for restrictions on Brazilian agriculture, and the World Bank adopted a small is beautiful approach. New measures had the effect of restricting food production in the Cerrado region, where farming conditions are ideal, which resulted in the need to open up new areas, like the Amazon, that are much less productive. Fighting poverty would help. As long as people are poor, there's always an incentive to develop marginal areas. Ultimately, the best strategy is to produce as much food as possible on the good farming areas and let nature reclaim the rest, as Europe has done. And in the end, criticism of Brazil from Emmanuel Macron was motivated a little by the desire to help the Amazon and a lot by the competition that Brazilian exports could create for French farmers. Chapter 3, entitled Enough with the Plastic Straws, starts by describing a gruesome viral video in which a marine biologist saves a turtle that had a plastic straw painfully wedged in its snout. Powerful stuff. And within days, Seattle, San Francisco, and the Starbucks chain all banned plastic straws. Yet the straw issue was a massive distraction. Straws make up only 0.03% of plastic waste in the oceans. The other 99.97% also does damage to fish and seabirds. Half the plastic waste in the oceans is from China, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. The solution is better waste collection and management, not banning plastic. Because the real issue is poverty. Some communities can't afford proper waste management. One study found that rich countries pay up to 14 times the cost to recycle plastic than to buy new, and concluded rich nations seeking to reduce plastic waste in the oceans should improve the trash collection in poor ones. Before industrial plastics, there were natural plastics. The ancient Romans molded turtle shells into combs and jewelry. In the 1800s, those sea turtles were getting scarce as their shells became frames for eyeglasses. Elephants were in demand. From the Middle Ages, ivory tusks were turned into caskets, goblets, sword handles. There was a shortage in the 1800s as elephants were killed to make billiard balls, piano keys, and cutlery handles. 160,000 elephants just in 1882. Then there were bioplastics like celluloid made from cellulose and cotton. But compared to petroleum plastics, plastics made from plants are reused less, hard to recycle, and have worse health impacts. Sugar-based plastics degrade into methane, creating more air pollution than regular plastics sitting in a landfill. Then there's the environmental impact on the land that's used to grow the materials for the bioplastics. California's ban on plastic bags actually increased emissions as it took more energy to make paper bags. And glass bottles can use 4 times the carbon as plastic since they require so much heat in their manufacture. Shellenberger speaks of the challenges of the penguins of New Zealand that are threatened by overfishing, coastal development, and aquaculture ponds. But their plight tends to be ignored by environmentalists and media that are only focused on plastic and climate change. The examples of the sea turtles and elephants reveal the paradox that it's only by embracing the artificial that we can save what's natural. We need to fight poverty to address the plastic issue. Economic development brings waste management. If the poorest nations don't have pipes, sewers, and clean water, the priority will be to deal with bodily human waste rather than plastic waste. Chapter 4, The Sixth Extinction is Cancelled, starts with various mass extinction theories, like the species area model, that have been proven false, but still sway public opinion against economic development. Then the chapter goes ape, how to save Congo's gorillas. In the Congo, wood and charcoal constitute more than 90% of residential primary energy. Virunga Park is a wildlife sanctuary, but with nearby Goma, a city of 2 million people dependent on charcoal made from wood, there's big incentive for illegal logging, and 25% of old growth in the southern half of the park has already been lost to charcoal production. Shellenberger describes an incident when a gorilla was assassinated by the mafia to send a message to the park ranger not to interfere with their charcoal business. Park officials and local chiefs are always at risk of being kidnapped or killed. Meanwhile, people living near the park report their crops are often eaten by baboons, gorillas, elephants, and buffalo. They aren't allowed to shoot the animals. Conservationists are seen as the boogeymen. It's neocolonialism, controlling the land based on goals dictated by the UN or Western interests. The solution? Congo needs fossil fuels. If people would cook with liquefied petroleum gas or electricity from coal-fired plants, they wouldn't need charcoal, so there would be no need to deforest the park or disturb the gorillas. Farms with tractors and equipment running on fossil fuels require less land, freeing up more space for animal habitat and reforestation. Fossil fuels can power factories employing the surplus farm workers replaced by the tractors. Sure, they burn carbon, but you save and even grow the forests that absorb carbon. This echoes the previous chapter. By embracing the artificial, we can save what's natural. Shellenberger once again flips the standard enviro narrative in chapter 5. Sweatshops save the planet. He starts by describing Extinction Rebellion protesters during London Fashion Week, covered in fake blood, blocking traffic with a staged funeral march, holding signs saying fashion equals ecocide and business as usual equals the end of life on Earth. Then he proceeds to explain how business is making life on Earth better, describing the Industrial Revolution as the great escape from poverty. The Industrial Age has raised life expectancy from 35 to 73 years, cut infant mortality from 43% to only 4%. As poor countries modernized from 1981 to 2015, the proportion of the world's population living in extreme poverty dropped from 44% to 10%. Malnutrition fell from 20% in 1990 to 11% in 2020. Things get better as humanity learns. Cleaner methods of burning coal and greater use of natural gas have improved air quality in rich countries, with sulfur dioxide down 91%, carbon monoxide down 83%, and lead down 99% from 1980 to 2018. Farmers have become more efficient, so they don't have to use as much water and fertilizer. Meanwhile, those still living in poverty deal with indoor air pollution, cooking by burning rice husks, animal dung, or firewood for heat. Such pollution shortens the lives of 4 million people a year, not counting the annoying amount of time it takes to chop and haul wood, start fires, and maintain them. The key is producing more food on less land. Since 1961, land use for agriculture rose 8%, while food production increased 300%. Machines replaced farm animals, freeing up land that was needed to grow crops to feed the animals. As technology becomes more available, crop yields will continue to rise, even under higher temperatures. There's some interesting stats. 2% of the American workforce is involved in farming, compared to 2/3 for Uganda. Wood provided 80% of the energy in the US in the 1860s, dropping to 7.5% by 1920. But in 2020, much of Africa was still dependent on wood for energy, like the Americans were in the 1800s. The climate alarmists resist efforts to modernize. Their goal is to make poverty sustainable rather than make poverty history. And if they succeed, there will be more deforestation, and it's that which causes the extinctions. Greed saved the whales, not Greenpeace. The conventional narrative is that whaling ended in 1975 after Greenpeace activists confronted Soviet whalers, giving the industry fatally bad publicity. But in chapter 6, Shellenberger flips the script again, explaining the free market had already done that. The Soviets were the last big whalers, not because it was profitable, but because they were tied to their archaic 5-year plans. Whale oil was valuable for streetlights and lubrication in the 1800s, but oil discoveries made it obsolete for a while. In a day, one Pennsylvania oil well produced as much oil as it took a whaling voyage 3 or 4 years to obtain. A Vanity Fair cartoon of 1861 depicts whales in tuxedos and ball gowns, celebrating the new oil industry. The whale business got a rebound in the early 1900s, when chemists figured out how to turn whale fat into margarine. But that subsided once palm oils proved a more profitable replacement. The advantage of petroleum over whale oil is energy density. More bang for the buck. A bit of chemistry. Coal is basically 1 atom of carbon and 1 atom of hydrogen. Petroleum is 1 carbon with 2 hydrogen, and natural gas 1 carbon with 4 hydrogen. Understandably, gas has less carbon emissions per unit of energy. As well, compared to coal, it has less sulfur dioxide, less pollution, requires less water to produce, yet is strongly opposed by many of the so-called environmentalists, perhaps clinging to the debunked theory that fracking causes drinking water to catch fire. After the book was published, a new threat to the whales emerged. Offshore wind farms create so much noise that some whale habitat is no longer livable. Shellenberger produced a 29-minute documentary exposing the problem. Highly recommended. I'll put a link in the description so you can watch it later for free. Sadly, the climate alarmists are willing to sacrifice the whales to advance their net zero goals. Chapter 7, Have Your Steak and Eat It Too, deals with environmental impact of meat production. In 2019, the IPCC recommended the world become vegan to fight climate change, saying emissions could drop by 70% by 2050. Sounds impressive, but that's 70% of agricultural emissions, not overall emissions, as most of emissions come from steel mills, concrete factories, transportation, and electrical generation. The impact of your chicken nuggets doesn't make much of a difference. A quarter of the Earth's land surface is used for meat production. That's a lot of grazing animals, maybe why 90% of climate scientists and environmentalists are vegetarian. But it's complicated. US meat comes mostly from factory farms, so production requires about 1/20th of the land of African producers. And in Congo, where there's less commercial meat production, people eat 2.2 million tons of wild animals a year, which is far worse for the environment as the animal population gradually dwindles. Shutting farms for the environment might just devastate wildlife instead. Shellenberger gets into the psychology of vegetarianism, a personal journey as he was vegetarian in the past. Meat brings out a disgust reaction in some people, bringing death and torture to mind. And activists often promote veganism for health reasons, but medical evidence has been mounting that animal-based diets can be very healthy. And eating meat is a very human thing to do. And most people who try vegetarian lifestyles often switch back to meat. So Shellenberger isn't recommending you be vegan to save the planet. Maybe eat more chicken than beef if you really feel you need to cut your emissions. Chapter 8, Saving Nature is Bomb. Again, it challenges the narrative that nuclear energy is too dangerous. Nobody died in the infamous 3 Mile Island accident. The only deaths in Fukushima meltdown were from unwise evacuations, not radiation. And in the worst nuclear disaster, Chernobyl, cancer deaths from radiation turned out to be far lower than had been predicted. To compare, there have been horrific fires on offshore oil rigs, natural gas pipeline explosions, and the biggest energy disaster, the 1975 collapse of the Banqiao hydro dam in China, which killed 200,000 people. In fact, nuclear is statistically the safest way of generating electricity and has now saved millions of lives by preventing air pollution. The public was pro-nuclear following Eisenhower's famous Atoms for Peace speech in 1953. Even in the 1960s, most environmentalists understood the positive trade-offs of nuclear. Plants would be a nuisance in small areas, but overall had less environmental impact than other forms of energy. From 1962 to 66, activists challenged only 12% of applications for new nuclear plants. But by the 70s, 73% were challenged. And now any proposal is opposed by armies of lobbyists, lawyers, and celebrity activists. With all the additional regulations and lawsuits against nuclear, power companies responded to increased demand by building more coal and oil plants, and the activists seemed to approve. There was a belief that nuclear plants were nothing more than atomic bombs ready to explode at any moment. Germany was the worst, closing all the safe and reliable nuclear power plants while spending $580 billion on renewables that could only serve a fraction of the demand. Had they spent that money on nuclear instead, they could have been producing 100% of their electricity carbon-free and still have enough energy left to power all their cars and light trucks. And the book was written before the Ukraine war, when Germany had to fire up the dirty coal plants when Russian gas was cut off. Now Germany has among the highest energy prices in the world, making their factories uncompetitive and their consumers poorer. Chapter 9 discusses destroying the environment to save it. It starts with a speech by Elon Musk in 2015, predicting that the combination of rooftop solar and batteries would solve all the world's energy problems. So far, rooftop is not catching on, despite huge subsidies of Tesla's Powerwall battery system. The economics still don't add up, as it would take decades for homeowners to recoup investments in rooftop. Paradoxes and conundrums abound. On cloudy days, large solar farms are useless, but on the best days in California, they have to pay other states to take their surplus power to avoid blowing out the grid. Storing that surplus isn't practical. Huge battery projects have been ridiculously expensive. Yet at best, can only store enough energy to power a community for a few hours. Meanwhile, oil companies have spent billions advertising and lobbying for renewables. They gain a public relations boost, but they also know that any solar or wind developments will always need fossil fuel backups for cloudy days with little wind. Attempts to back up solar with renewables have been counterproductive. Power plants running on wood chips require huge amounts of deforestation. Growing plants for ethanol is also a lost cause, both in terms of land use and emissions. Scientists now know that corn making and using ethanol emits twice as much greenhouse gas as gasoline. And forests have to be ripped out to replace food production lost through corn being converted to energy. The problem is that biomass is much less energy dense than uranium or gas. The fact that energy density of fuels and the power density of their extraction determine their environmental impact should be taught in every environmental studies class. Unfortunately, it is not. These are expensive mistakes, with US taxpayers on the hook for $24 billion for failed biofuel experiments from 2009 to 2015, and even Brazilian sugarcane ethanol, the world's most efficient, requires 400 times more land than petroleum. Germany has also failed with hydrogen, learning the hard way that it takes so much energy to produce hydrogen that it makes no sense to use it as a fuel source. The chapter highlights the environmental dangers of wind turbines, which are killing off so many bats that some species are threatened with extinction. Same story with birds, with some species like the whooping crane that already had a small population are at further risk. The wind turbines kill mostly the large birds that don't breed as quickly, so it's harder to replace their losses. Eagles, owls, hawks, falcons, and others. And apart from the direct killing, the wind farms take up so much land, hundreds of times more than gas or nuclear plants, and they encroach on animal habitat, including black bears in Vermont. And the wind industry donates money to bird lovers and environmental groups. So the Sierra Club and the Environmental Defense Fund have publicly defended turbines. Solar also destroys animal habitat, for example, desert tortoises and bighorn sheep. If you wanted to convert all the energy in the US to renewables, it will require an estimated 25 to 50% of the country's entire land mass. Another irony is that renewables aren't really renewable. Solar panels and wind turbines also require far more in the way of materials and produce more in the way of waste. Solar panels require 16 times more materials in the form of cement, glass, concrete, and steel than do nuclear plants, and create 300 times more waste. They also have lead and other toxic chemicals that end up in landfill, since the panels can't be recycled. Renewables have a romantic appeal to nature vibe, but it's a fallacy. Solar isn't necessarily better just because sunlight is natural, and new installations tend to follow the Starbucks rule. Never build within 30 miles of a Starbucks, because those customers are the most likely to protest. Not in my backyard. Chapter 10, all about the green, is shocking, outlining the deceit, conflicts of interest, and outright corruption of mainstream environmentalists. Climate activists massively outspend climate skeptics. At the time of writing, the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, had a combined annual budget of $384 million, compared to only $13 million for the Competitive Enterprise Institute and the Heartland Institute, two of the most prominent net zero opponents. The $384 million in 1 year is more money than Exxon paid to skeptic groups over 2 decades. But what's shocking is that much of the funding for the environmental groups comes from the oil industry. Shellenberger documents that 350.org, the Sierra Club, NRDC, and EDF all got significant funding from big oil, apparently in exchange for publicly attacking nuclear. Oil companies can afford to have these groups promote wind and solar because they're intermittent and require backup, usually fossil fuels. But nuclear, which operates 24/7 and requires hundreds of the land requirements, is potentially a competitor that could replace oil and gas plants. In fact, almost every time a nuclear plant was closed, it was replaced by coal or gas. Big oil funding solar sounds like a conspiracy theory that could lead to libel suits, but Shellenberger backs up every claim. There are 100 citations just for this chapter. Similarly, academia is compromised. Stanford University's Mark Jacobson, a leading voice claiming that renewables alone can power the planet without the need for nuclear, is also funded by investors in oil and gas and renewables. Shellenberger laments that the news media demonizes Exxon and the climate skeptics while giving a free pass to fossil fuel billionaires and the environmentalists they fund. Conflicts of interest abound as charities are outed as being oil company shareholders, and EDF and NRDC lawyers and lobbyists drafted much of the cap and trade regulations so their donors could benefit from the resulting carbon trading market, which could one day be worth $1 trillion. The book was written around the time of the Democratic Party primaries for the 2020 election. Two of the candidates, Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg, owned major investments in oil and gas. A third, Pete Buttigieg, also received donations from Steyer. And a fourth, Kamala Harris, as California Attorney General, had previously killed an investigation into Governor Jerry Brown's corruption. Over the years, Brown, whose family was tied to Indonesian oil interests, blocked so many nuclear plants that California's electricity could have been 100% emissions-free. One of the many Jerry Brown stories in the chapter is when he hired the top investment manager for Getty Oil to be a Superior Court judge, who lobbied for and passed legislation protecting Getty Oil money from taxation. Oh, and the judge's name was Bill Newsom, father of current Governor Gavin Newsom. Then there was Al Gore Sr. and Jr., with financial ties to Occidental Petroleum. Jr., the inconvenient Truth Gore, also pocketed $100 million from the Qataris when he sold his near-worthless TV channel. Barack Obama's Green New Deal programs were a giant slush fund. At least 10 members of Obama's Finance Committee and more than 12 of his fundraising bundlers who raised a minimum of $100,000 for Obama benefited from $16.4 billion of the $20.5 billion in stimulus loans. Most notorious was billionaire donor and fundraising bundler George Kaiser, whose company Solyndra got $573 million and went bankrupt soon after. Another billionaire, Vinod Khosla, a major financial contributor to the Dems and an Obama advisor in the 2008 election, received $300 million for his companies. And billionaire venture capitalist John Doerr, who donated $2 million, benefited when 16 companies in his portfolio received federal stimulus loans. My personal reaction to this chapter is that environmentalists don't actually want to solve anything. If nuclear decarbonized the energy sector, they'd lose their cushy jobs, donations, and government grants fighting carbon. Chapter 11, The Denial of Power, focuses on the rich of the world using the environment as an excuse to keep poor people poor. It starts by describing a conference of rich celebrities meeting at a posh Italian resort in 2019 to demand action on climate change. 40 private jets arrived on the first night. 70 more arrived later. Some people came by helicopter. Those not sleeping over at the resort bunked in super yachts and were ferried to the event in Maseratis. Activists are the worst offenders. Even Greta Thunberg's famous sailboat ride to New York shows hypocrisy. The crew flew to the boat launch and flew home after the trip, racking up 4 times the emissions that Greta would have had if she just flew. The rich activists won't cut their own energy consumption, but expect the poor to cut theirs. Today, World Bank is diverting funds from cheap and reliable energy sources like hydroelectricity, fossil fuels, and nuclear to expensive and unreliable ones like solar and wind. And in October 2019, the European Investment Bank announced it would halt all financing of fossil fuels in poor nations by 2021. Rich countries have already developed 70% of their hydroelectric potential, compared to only 3% for Africa. The UN's 1987 book, Our Common Future, pioneered the notion that poor nations could grow rich without using much energy. The idea is called leapfrogging. Don't let African energy evolve from wood to fossil fuels and hydro. Just jump ahead to wind and solar. It doesn't matter that no nation has ever escaped poverty with renewables. It's an experiment on the most vulnerable people in the world. So in the late 1980s, World Bank switched to sustainable development, small-scale renewable energy projects, rather than the large-scale hydro projects that could become game changers in people's lives. The California-based NGO International Rivers helped stop 217 dams from being built, mostly in poor nations. Why? They like river rafting. More disgusting, Shellenberger recounts a party at the Dutch embassy in Rwanda, where guests were celebrating a Dutch-German energy project, which would allow some Rwandans to harness biogas from human feces for cooking. The chapter traces the anti-human attitudes of environmentalist thought. Thomas Malthus posited that disaster was inevitable, believing that food production could only grow arithmetically, while population could grow exponentially. While this sounds like a mathematical stance, at its heart is a deep loathing of the human race, particularly poor people. The ideas survived even as industrialization made food production more successful. William Vogt's 1948 bestseller, The Road to Survival, attacked the medical profession for keeping people alive, supposedly increasing misery. He recommended the UN maintain an ecological commission to control resource exploitation in technologically retarded nations. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson called for population control, calling the explosion of population the world's #1 problem. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb, a book conceived and edited by Sierra Club director David Brower, which warned, in the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. Like Vogt and Malthus, Ehrlich was very concerned about breeding by poor people. There was Professor Garrett Hardin's essay, 1974, Lifeboat Ethics, The Case Against Helping the Poor, and the Club of Rome's Limits of Growth, 1972, arguing that the world was on the brink of ecological disaster. These ideas were popular at the time, getting lots of coverage in the New York Times and others. Ehrlich sold 3 million copies of his book and appeared 6 times on Johnny Carson. The Malthusians accepted the idea of some foreign aid as charity, but not as infrastructure, especially energy. Ehrlich opposed nuclear energy because it was abundant. Giving society cheap, abundant energy at this point would be the moral equivalent of giving an idiot a machine gun. Instead, he called for more labor-intensive agriculture, ensuring small-time farmers stayed small-time. This is what now is known as sustainable development. Sounds more like perpetual poverty. Of course, these are only Western ideas. In 1981, Indian economist Amartya Sen argued famines resulted from war, political oppression, and distribution issues, not on production issues. Sen won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1998. Over time, the predictions of the population bomb and limits to growth proved to be embarrassingly wrong. Sure, the population doubled, but food production increased. There was less starvation, less poverty, and more energy. As it became clear that the growth in global birth rate had peaked, Malthusian thinkers started to look to climate change as a replacement apocalypse for overpopulation and resource scarcity. Shellenberger names the book End of Nature as the crossover work. Written by Bill McKibben, seen earlier in the book accepting oil money while lobbying against nuclear plants, the book is the first climate change disaster global warming book for a general audience. Bill says the population must drop to between 100 million and 2 billion. And with leaders like this, the environmentalists are pushing for policies that cause food shortages by lobbying against irrigation projects and agricultural modernization. 20% of aid agency funding was for agricultural development in 1980, compared to 3% in 2005. And since the book was written, we've seen anti-food policies around the world in the name of net zero. A fertilizer ban in Sri Lanka, burp taxes on New Zealand livestock, cattle culls in France and Ireland, and even expropriation of Dutch farmers. Chapter 12, False Gods for Lost Souls, talks about alarmist propaganda that the polar bears are going extinct. Their population has been stable or even growing for the last 50 years. But the alarmists push the false narrative that researchers like Susan Crockford, who report on the health of the species, are climate-denying dupes paid off by big oil. But there's no evidence of that. Similarly, there was a campaign by alarmist politicians and media to smear Roger Pielke Jr., a climate scientist who sometimes criticized the IPCC. Again, there were false allegations of oil money payments. Why would these people lie? Well, they need to convince people that a climate disaster is happening now to justify government legislation and funding of climate-related projects. The character assassination of Pielke sends a chilling message to all academics. Toe the party line, even if it means abandoning your scientific principles, or face funding cuts, demonization, and ostracism in a McCarthy-esque fashion. Politics trumps science. Then there's a story of former IPCC scientist Richard Toll, who explained that IPCC is partly a scientific organization and partly a political organization. As a political organization, its job is to justify greenhouse gas emission reduction. At first, the IPCC said climate change was not without risk, but manageable, but later shifted to, we're all gonna die! The authors of IPCC's Summary for Policymakers misrepresented the conclusions of scientists like Toll. Their press releases and statements betrayed ideological motivations, a tendency towards exaggeration, and an absence of important context. Next, the apocalyptic media would exaggerate the exaggerations, further scaring and misinforming the public. And what the IPCC doesn't say can be even more misleading, like failing to admit that the death toll from natural disasters has radically declined and should decline further with adaptation. And that fertilizers, tractors, and irrigation matter more than climate change to crop yields, and that the impact of forest fires depends more on wood fuel buildup and constructing homes near forests rather than climate change. This last point became evident after the January fires in California. Mainstream media and net zero politicians blame the fires on climate change, while independent journalists blame them on incompetent forest management, and aired old clips of Donald Trump telling Gavin Newsom to his face that California should be cleaning up dry tinder from the forest floor to prevent fires from spreading. Practices that are done in most developed nations. Chapter 12 explores the psychology of net zero believers. Some think the world is an evil place and it would be better if it were destroyed and turned back over to the natural kingdom. Or perhaps the climate apocalypse is a subconscious fantasy for people who dislike civilization. This may explain why those who are the most alarmist are most opposed to the technologies that would address the problems. They say global warming will cause food shortages, but then they oppose fertilizer and irrigation projects. They warn about carbon dioxide, but oppose zero-emission nuclear plants. Not surprisingly, some people are starting to describe the most radical of them, like Extinction Rebellion, as an upper-middle-class death cult. Environmentalism is described as a secular religion. It provides a new story about our collective and individual purposes. It designates good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains, and it does so in the language of science, which provides it with legitimacy. As such, it meets some people's spiritual and psychological needs. They hope to find meaning and a new way of casting themselves as heroes. The trouble is that this religion has become increasingly apocalyptic, destructive, and self-defeating. It leads its adherents to demonize their opponents, often hypocritically. It drives them to seek to restrict power and prosperity at home and abroad. And it spreads anxiety and depression without meeting the deeper psychological, existential, and spiritual needs its ostensibly secular devotees seek. Greta Thunberg is an example. She said when she read the dire predictions about the polar bears, she became ill and depressed. Then she spread her depression by telling the world she wanted them to panic.
I want you to panic. And I want you to panic. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic.
Alarmists depress themselves. It's too late to do anything. There's no future anymore. We're basically doomed. Shellenberger shares his own experiences, saying when his thinking aligned more with the doomsters, reading eco books would make him sadder and anxious. But the attitude really masked other negative aspects of his life. Now he calls for optimism, noting air pollution peaked 50 years ago, carbon emissions have peaked in most countries, the amount of land needed for meat production is declining, forests are growing back in rich nations, deaths from climate extremes are declining, and technology can save gorilla habitat. The author also follows up on people mentioned earlier in the book. Supardi, the Indonesian subsistence farmer who moved to the city, has learned new job skills and has had promotions at the company where she works, and her family has a much more promising future than if she'd stayed on the land. The Bernadette from Congo, not so lucky. She's a refugee, can't return to her farm because the charcoal mafia controlling the area would kill her family. Shellenberger mentions her to inspire empathy and solidarity for those who do not yet enjoy the fruits of prosperity. The picture painted by the apocalyptic environmentalists is inaccurate and dehumanizing, he says, and calls on rich nations to support development of poor nations, with solutions including high-density farming, nuclear energy, and natural gas when it's the best option. Nature and prosperity for all.